my feeling is that as somebody who spent his life in mathematics, like I'm so excited about it. I'm excited every time I think about it. I'm excited when I learn about it. I feel like my role as a teacher is just to be excited in public.
Mm.
But I think people get to decide what their own life is. They shouldn't have to listen to me as to how their life should be. But what I do think is that all of us have stuff that just like lights up our minds. And I think for most people, it's enjoyable to be in the presence of people who are talking about the things that they're most lit up about. But what people choose to take from that, I want to let them choose, which I think is kind of the opposite of sermonizing.
Yeah.
I'm Ron Jor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Jordan Ellenberg is a professor of mathematics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the best-selling author of How Not to Be Wrong, The Power of Mathematical Thinking, and the new Shape, The Hidden Geometry of Information, Biology, Strategy, Democracy, and Everything Else. He earned his PhD in mathematics from Harvard and an MFA in creative writing from Johns Hopkins. Has researched number theory and algebraic geometry, and has been writing about math to mass audiences in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and The Believer, and as a regular columnist for Slate. In this conversation, we discuss how he fell in love with math as a child, his life in math and in writing, his new book Shape, and the application of math and geometry to politics, artificial intelligence, reality, and philosophy. We also talk about math education and the inherent tension between a more rigid model of memorization and practice and the desire to teach math as a way of approaching problems. This is an especially personal problem for me as a child of a mathematician who is of the more rigid school of thinking. Someone who actually enjoyed some aspects of mathematical education, but definitely not the more rigid, routine memorization aspects. So if you felt the same about math, and if you grew up thinking you're bad at math or you don't enjoy math, I think Jordan might help you see the relevance and the beauty and the creativity at the root of math, and that's worth doing. So let's jump right in with Jordan Ellenberg. All right. I'm sitting across the screen from Jordan Ellenberg. Jordan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So these days we're transitioning because COVID is beginning to wane down. So for months now, my first question was, how are you doing? And what is it like where you are and all that, those kinds of questions. But I think it's still relevant factor in our experience. So tell us about where you are, how you experienced the weird past year, and to get us into kind of a mindset of where we are now.
Well, I live in Madison, Wisconsin, which I don't know if your listeners know the place, but it's a small city, about 250,000 people, which means that people are generally not packed into apartments. It's actually, in many ways, we played this on easy mode. There's like lots of green space, and so it was not so hard to be out and among people in environments that were not particularly compromising from a COVID point of view throughout this whole thing. So I think we've been lucky to not feel isolated and alone during this, which is something that a lot of people, I think, had to go through, and for good. My kids are at camp right now. This is something that did not happen last summer and is happening this summer. So obviously we have figured out a lot about how to handle this. And I learned how to teach on the screen, which I think at first I was like, this is going to be a complete cluster. This is going to be impossible. And honestly, the beginning of my first semester was maybe not so good. I think at least at the college level, we got pretty good at teaching on the screen. Now, speaking of playing the pandemic on easy mode, teaching college students is one thing. I think for my kids who are in high school and elementary school, teaching at the K-12 level and having that be like a good experience is a lot more difficult than it was to replicate the college experience. But I think we got pretty good at it. I say it's a lot like planning a wedding, right? You develop like all these very specialized skills in online teaching, and you hope you only have to use them once.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I feel like I've done quite a few webinars once COVID hit, and in some ways there you're able to engage more people if you do it thoughtfully than you would in a classroom of 100 people, right? Like it's like where most people are just silent. If so, did you find any benefits to like doing things online?
Yeah, some. I would say to that, I would say, first of all, there's always a curve where you can, in principle, engage more people, but maybe the average level of engagement is not as high. And so
Mm,
there's some kind of curve of like, where is the total amount of engagement maximized? But in class, what I found, and again, it probably took me most of a year to figure out how to manage this well. What I would love to see us find some way to bring into our physical teaching is the chat window. The chat window is
mm,
awesome. That's the best thing about online teaching because I think the biggest problem we have in the math classroom, and it's an interesting question whether they're the same in other kinds of classrooms, but for us, the biggest problem is the students are anxious about asking questions. If they're confused about something, it's very hard for that student to kind of reason. If I'm confused, there's probably 10 other kids who are confused. And so I should
mm.
probably ask. Kids are hesitant to halt the lecture and make everybody listen to their question. What if the question's stupid? Like, what if the question doesn't make sense? Whatever. And the bigger the class is, the more they feel like they can't impose their question on anybody else. So, what the text chat window allows you to do is it allows a student to type something in, and then I, the lecturer, I see it, but I can choose to continue with my lecture or stop and answer it. And often like, another student will pop in and say something to the question. So it gives like a much lower stakes way of actively participating in the lecture. Whereas in the physical classroom, as it's traditionally construed, it's all or nothing. You're either going to
Yeah,
stop the whole class for like dozens and dozens of kids, or
yeah.
you're going to say nothing and just suck it up. And having this, I haven't figured it out. I don't know if you have any ideas. Do you teach? I don't know if.
Yeah, yeah. So I do a lot of design workshops and teach product design. And one of the things that I actually did in our last physical event before COVID was experiment exactly with that. This was in Tel Aviv, and everybody in Israel uses WhatsApp. It's a very popular chat app, like iMessage. But and what's
I have
cool
Israeli
is
cousins. I know what it is.
okay, cool.
Mhm.
And the cool thing is like in WhatsApp, you can create a group and then you get a barcode for that group or a QR code for that group. And so we literally in the beginning of the lecture put a QR code on the thing and say all the participation, I'm going to ask you questions, but you're 150 people, so you ask it in the chat group and you participate on the chat group. And it was hopping. It was like the best webinar that I've ever had in terms of hundreds of people writing messages. It was funny, it was energetic. And because everybody has this app, all they had to do was scan it and participate.
Two questions. One, can you see it while you're teaching? Can you see the activity in the WhatsApp while you're presenting?
Yeah, I just have my phone open on WhatsApp on the podium and I can see what's going on, but it can be distracting, so I pay attention to it when I can.
Oh, I see. But you're standing at a podium when you're presenting.
Yeah.
I see. See, I'm walking around and writing on the board.
Yeah, so essentially I stand at a podium and that's where I would get the messages in this scenario, but you could definitely project it on the wall or do something like that. But I want to get into the math in your books. And I guess the first question that we found that helped to understand a little bit more about the person was what's something you learned in childhood that still drives you today, that still affects how you do your work today, that still kind of stayed with you since then?
Well, I would say a feature of mathematics that is something that really attracts me to the subject and always has since I was a kid, and it's something I write about in the book actually near the end, is this rather special feature that you can really make knowledge yourself from scratch. And that's pretty rare, right? I mean, in other things you study in school, in some sense, you are reliant on authority that comes from somewhere else, whether it's the teacher or whether it's a book in the library that sort of tells you some historical facts or something like that. You're resting on authority. Whereas in math, you really build it up yourself for some basic set of principles. If you can prove something, it's true. And it's true
Mm.
not because somebody told you it was true, or not because it's officially true, or not because it's marked correct on the exam, but because it is true. And that's, to me, potentially very empowering. Have
Mm.
the locus of authority be within yourself. In some way, I would compare it with among artists. So there's people who like working on movies and there's people who like writing. And I'm a writer, same personality. When you write, everything is from you. You create it yourself. And whereas in other kinds of art, it's something like movies are an inherently collaborative medium where it's not just you, right? Everything you do involves like a lot of other people, and the final product doesn't have it's not the product of sort of one mind, so to speak,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you rely on others. That said, though, math kind of features both because on the one hand, there's this feeling that you can just create knowledge completely on your own. On the other hand, the enterprise of mathematics is intensely communitarian. It's the actual enterprise of research mathematics is not about, predominantly at any rate, it's not about going off on your own and making new knowledge without anybody else. That's sort of part of it, but it's also part of putting stones in this edifice, this kind of like grand project that's thousands of years old that each one of us adds a little bit to and then seeds ground to the next generation of people. That's another sort of special satisfaction to mathematics that I probably didn't understand as a kid the way I understand now as an adult. I tell the story in my first book, How Not to Be Wrong, of being a child and kind of just gazing, kind of eyes unfocused as a kid does. And I was looking at my parents' stereo. And for the younger listeners, let me tell you how things were in the 70s. If you had like a cool stereo system, it was going to be like encased in wood paneling. God forbid, like the actual electronics of the stereo should be visible. And of course, the wood paneling had a pattern of holes in it so the sound could get out. And the holes were in a rectangular array, a 6x8 rectangular array. And there I was, like unfocusedly looking at this rectangle of holes, noticing that there were 6 rows of 8 holes each. But at the same time, there were 8 columns of 6 holes each. So that those 48 holes, they were 6 8s, but they were also 8 6s. In other words, this was explaining why 6 times 8 was the same thing as 8 times 6. A fact that I knew because, one learns one's multiplication tables. And I think most children who learn the multiplication table quickly notice that there's this pattern that 6 times 8 is the same as 8 times 6, and 3 times 7 is the same as 7 times 3, and et cetera, et cetera. But the realization that that was not true because it was in the multiplication table, but rather it was true, because it could be directly observed as a fact about a physical thing, that was absolutely stunning to me. And we all look back on our lives and rearrange the stories so that they make more sense. But in my sort of retrospectively told story of my life, like that's the moment at which I grasped like what math was really about and what made it different from other things that you might spend your time thinking about.
Yeah. So let's dive into this moment. What was so striking about it to you? Was it that you didn't need the learning the rules? It was something, it kind of a more direct connection. What was the core of the aha in that moment?
I wouldn't actually say it had so much to do with the fact that it was in the real world, that it was like a chunk of wood in my living room. That was not so relevant. It was much more that it was a more abstract realization, right? Because it was not a realization about holes in a wooden board. It was a realization about anything times anything.
Yeah.
And that those could be reversed and get the same result. You could like instantly leap to generalize from the real world case before you to this actually infinite array of similar cases, which is again a very typical moment of mathematics. Where the book ends, or almost ends, is with this poem by Rita Dove called Geometry. Rita Dove is a very famous poet, the former poet laureate of the United States. I didn't know that she wrote a poem called Geometry. I wouldn't put it in the book proposal if I'd known that, but I came across it while I was writing. And she writes about this very similar moment. Her poem Geometry starts, I prove a theorem and the house expands. I took that in a line as the title of the last chapter. Yeah. Just writing about this moment of, math class, which for many children, for reasons we can talk about if you want, is seen as a prison. For her, it's quite the opposite. She writes about this like liberatory experience of like, in understanding this fact of geometry, the walls blow out, everything explodes in a good way.
Yeah, interesting. So it sounds like after these early revelations, you went all in. You got fascinated with math, and I read that by second grade, you're already helping older people with their homework, and by fourth grade, we were already in competitions. So did this come from the environment? Did you feel like you had the right supporting environment? Did you just personal fascination of just diving deeper and deeper into math?
Again, I feel like our conversation is going to be every question, is it this or that? And I'm going to be like, both. So we can keep on doing
conversation. That's interesting. Yeah.
It's always both. There's very little that's univalent in real life. I certainly had a sort of an unusual driving interest, and I had it from when I was a small child, which, by the way, is by no means universal. among mathematicians. I think there's a stereotype that if you're going to do mathematics for your life, that's visible at age 7 or something. That was true for me, but it's definitely not true for most of my colleagues. There's all kinds of life stories and all kinds of pathways in. At the same time, yeah, my parents are both statisticians. My mom, before she got her PhD, was a high school math teacher. So I certainly grew up in a mathy kind of a house, which not everybody does. And I think a challenge that our community is working with now is like, how can we expand that out so that kids who don't live in a math house, or who don't live next door to a research university, or who don't have a sort of super energetic, passionate teacher like in their high school or junior high school or elementary school. In theory, because of the internet, we should be able to make things more available to a wider group of people than we have before. And I would say so far, I would not say that we've particularly succeeded at that.
At least not with math. I think with some things, maybe I think programming, you have people all over the world learning to program, even though they don't have it in their immediate surrounding. So super interesting. Your journey takes you go into academia and you do the academic math work, actually studying at a very early age. What brings you to write How Not to Be Wrong? So this is your kind of best-selling book, and I want to talk more about it, but what makes you decide to write it?
So first of all, the story is a little bit more complicated than that, because when I finished college, I didn't go straight to get my PhD. I was figuring out what I wanted to do. And I actually went and was a writer for a year. I went and did like a master's degree in creative writing at Johns Hopkins, and was like, maybe what I want to do is write novels and be in the world of literature and hang out with writers and have that be my life. And I found out I did not care for that life. Writing fiction is incredibly emotionally strenuous. The rewards are very long term and like very slow to come and often very meager. But that said, I learned like a huge amount. And I think it was like really valuable to me to spend that year where I was seen as a writer and treated as a writer, because that was what made me believe that I could do what I ended up doing later, which is like write books about mathematics. You know what I mean? I always say this to students, because students are like quite naturally very insecure. Like they're young and they don't know what they're capable of and they don't know what they can do. And I tell them, if you put yourself in an environment where people are going to treat you like X, you're going to feel like X. That's just how humans are, right? If you're worried, I don't feel like I'm a real X. I'm like, just go someplace and label yourself as an X. And when people address you as X, you're going to feel like you really are one. So to me, I had written a ton and I was really interested in it. But having that year where everyone addressed me as a writer made me feel completely different about it. Like it wasn't just a hobby, but one of the things that I was and one of the things that I could really do. So how did I come to write How Not to Be Wrong? In academia, we have this sabbatical system where like every 7 years, they're like, okay, you have a year where you're not going to teach. You're going to work on some bigger project that can only be undertaken when you have some uninterrupted time to really do it. And typically what people do is they move off to some exotic locale to like work with researchers who they ordinarily wouldn't work with. And that was at the time of my first sabbatical. We had an infant, and we had a young child and an infant, and moving cities was just not really on the cards. And so I was like, okay, if I'm not going to move physically, I'm going to move psychically. Instead of like undertaking some sort of slightly more ambitious math research project along the lines of what I've been doing, I'm going to mentally move into a completely different space and do a completely different thing. So that was when I was like, now's the time. Like now's the time to sit down and write a book. So that was really the origin of that project.
Yeah. And I love that book. I love the title. And the full title is How Not to Be Wrong, The Power of Mathematical Thinking. And I think you spend time fighting misconceptions or not fighting, but arguing against misconceptions and aversion that many people have against math. And I think in this audience, we have a lot of creative people. We have a lot of designers. Some of them the most math that they do is like calculating pixels and ratios and stuff. But what is your pitch for people in the creative fields, which you are part of too, in terms of learning to see the world in this way? Help them come out of their mathematical shell?
Well, one thing I would say is that actually people in design are perfectly well situated to appreciate this message, because I think probably there's a lot of designers who come in contact with people who are like, I don't care about design. Like, I just care if the thing works. And I think the response to that, tell me if I'm ventriloquizing your entire profession correctly, would be like, you know what? You probably care about design more than you think you do. There's probably ways you think about things and things that you appreciate that are about design, but you don't phrase it as such. Like you don't articulate it in that way. So that's how I see math. And in some sense, part of the message of both my books is that there's lots of stuff that is mathematical, even if people don't see it as mathematical. So in the new book, a book about geometry, there is a danger that people are going to think it's about triangles. And I'm not going to say there's no triangles in the book. I love triangles. So there's some, but in modern terms, geometric thinking is like very general. It applies to like any context in which we talk about things being close together or things being far apart. So when we like reason, one of the things I write about a lot is developments in AI and in artificial language production and like stuff like that. And when we say that two words are close in meaning, that is a geometric statement, right? We're implicitly talking about some kind of geometry of all words, which sounds like just a metaphor. And one of the things I write about in the book is what does it look like if we try to make that not a metaphor? What does it look like if we like literally try to place words in space? And what's the history of that idea? And what can we learn about English language usage? And but the point is that even if you don't do that formal thing, you still have the idea of words being close or distant in meaning. These two words are closer than these other two words. And so I would say that people are already reasoning geometrically about their language, about their thoughts, about their design for that matter, whether I hector them about it or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And I go back and let's talk about your new book, Shape. So it really brought back some memories from high school for me because so I liked geometry, but I was terrible memorizing the laws, the different, like all the different sentences that they had. And I have this very vivid memory. We had this massive exam, and the geometry teacher comes in after the exam with holding my test, like my exam above her head into the room. And I'm like, what's going on? And she's like, Eran's test is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I gave you a challenge geometry problem that almost nobody solved, almost nobody proved. Eran proved it, but because he didn't remember any of the sentences, he went back, way, way back and proved the whole thing. Now, because it took a long time, that's the only thing in the test that he actually got to. And so Eran failed. but this, because I think it was like, to me, it was like, I love proving stuff. I hated memorizing stuff. And I think your book is about that, about how so one of the things you said is about returning Euclid into a museum piece. And you wrote this beautiful sentence that I love is, what we most admire is put in a box and made dull. So how do you think about how we teach geometry today and, how we should be teaching it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting subject that I actually learned a lot about researching the book because, I have my own experience from being an American and going to American school in the 80s. And were you in Israel? Is this where you took this class or was that
this
here?
Is Israel.
Okay.
Yeah. And the teachers were all Russian for some reason. They're all like former USSR.
Yes, really old. You can go back to the 19th century and there's like a figure in, now I forgot which George Eliot novel it is. I think it's The Mill on the Floss, where there's this sort of comic figure of an sort of somewhat evil like school teacher inflicting Euclid on the students. And in the old days, this is how it was. If you're like not happy with your kids' geometry education now, it used to be that people would just be asked to memorize and recite the statements of Euclid. That was the class, that if you can correctly recite from memory these propositions and their proofs, then you pass the class, which would not be even considered any part of pedagogy today. But yes, this kind of tension between, is the goal to know all the facts, or is the goal to develop the sort of mental habits and skills to reproduce those facts on your own? Those are both really valuable. And like what you did on that exam was awesome. But at the same time, there's a reason that your teacher might have wanted you to not do it that way, to have, well, I wouldn't say memorized, because when you say memorization, it sounds like very rote. I think what a teacher is typically aiming for is something more like what I would call fluency. So for instance, if you're learning a foreign language, you could say, I don't memorizing like long lists of words. But when you're actually learning, if for instance, you go to that country and speak to people, it doesn't feel like memorization. Like you acquire fluency in a language by experience, and languages make sense. The things fit together and you learn things by context with other things. And it's not like memorizing nonsense syllables, because it makes sense and there's a structure. And geometry is much the same way. And in the same way as like you wouldn't say I've achieved competence in a language because I have a dictionary. I didn't memorize any words, but I can just look up each word I need. In the end, you can't read a novel. It would take too long and you wouldn't really be able to follow what's going on. You do need to actually, so I would say that somehow, again, it's a tall order, but what we really want to accomplish in a geometry classroom is, yes, for people to know all those propositions, but know them not because they memorize them by rote, but because they make sense and fit into a structure, and the student by experience like has some familiarity with that structure, and that makes it easier to know those things. But it's funny, like one thing I learned researching this is that we have this stereotype that like old-fashioned teaching is like more rigorous, but also more dull, and also more about memorization, but the students like really know anything. So one thing I found was this kind of like innovative geometry textbook called Inventional Geometry that was like, our approach is going to be the student should develop all the knowledge by themselves. The whole textbook is just like a list of problems that you're supposed to do in order and think about things. And we're not going to tell you anything. The student is going to generate this knowledge. And you read this and you're like, oh, wow, this is this kind of like loosey-goosey kind of new pedagogy. Like it's probably like, maybe it's from the 70s or maybe it's like new and I don't know, like it's innovative, but is it really going to work? These kind of newfangled things. Okay, this book is from 1860. So every argument that we have about how to teach, I got to say we've been having for a long time. We could go in a circle. I don't think there's that many like new ideas in how to do this. We have been having the same arguments again and again. And in the end, the answer is always going to be both, that students have to acquire fluency and know certain things, but also develop those mental skills and those habits of being able to do what you did, which is reproduce that stuff as needed because it actually makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting.
What's your experience taking the test? I'm curious, like when you were taking that test and not doing any of the other questions and just focusing on this extra credit problem, do you remember what your emotional state was?
I think I got really wrapped up in the problem, and only once I proved it, I realized I was running out of time. So I think I enjoyed solving that problem and then freaked out at the end, if I have to.
To me, that's a win. You were in a state of flow, as they call it. You actually had a mathematical experience, which often like a student can go through a whole class without having.
Yeah. And
you failed, but you failed well.
Exactly. I wish I had you as a teacher. I think that you could probably, I was probably gettable as a student. I wasn't, my dad is a mathematician, so I had a little bit of a rebellion because he's a very old fashioned teacher, and it was all about learning the rules, and he got really frustrated with me when I forgot like certain techniques, and so I think I kind of rebelled, but I think I was gettable. If someone like you came along and said, hey, this is like a language, you know how you're enjoying learning, new languages, maybe try this. I think we'll probably be more versed in this stuff.
This gives me a lot to say. I want to put you on the couch now, man, because now we're going deep. But so first of all, you got to read these Rita Dove poems. And she has another poem that I also quote in the book, which is literally exactly about what you just said. Her father was, I want to say, a chemical engineer. And she writes exactly about this experience of her father lovingly, but rather sternly drilling her in arithmetic in a way that he clearly meant for good ends, which she did not experience as. It's a contrast with her geometry poem. There's a matched set. So definitely read her poem Flashcards, which is basically about you, although she doesn't know you. But it is. First of all, parents and children, it's a different relationship from teacher. I have the same thing with my own kids where I'm like, you'll listen to it from your math teacher. Like, why won't you listen to it from me? But it's different. It's emotionally fraught when it's your own child in a way that it's not with a teacher. The other thing I will say, and I probably you guys know this, is that, Russian math teachers are scary. Let's face it. Let's call it a spade. I remember when I was young learning from Misha Brin, who, if you know that name, that's Sergey Brin's dad, like the guy who founded Google. Like his dad is a kind of classic older Russian emigre math professor who I studied from when I was going to classes at the University of Maryland. And when I was a teenager, in Israel, you must meet a lot of Russians. For me as an American, that was my first experience with the Russian math type. And I was in a state of abject terror the entire time because these guys are very tough and they project a kind of no nonsense atmosphere, which it worked fine for me. It worked fine. I wasn't overcome by my fear, but definitely it was bruising.
No, it's funny. It just reminds me of I had also a Russian physics teacher in high school, which I loved. But one time he caught us playing chess in class, and he just had this offended look on his face. Like, how could you play chess while I'm explaining physics to you? And I just remember like he kicked us out of the class, and I just remember feeling so bad. And then he came out and he was like, nah, like he was like, he forgave me. And it was so important. There's this relationship of authority that they know how to cultivate somehow. So you're afraid of them, but you like them and you want to live up to their expectations. That was my experience with my.
Yeah, but it was only because it was chess. If you'd been reading a novel or something, like he probably would have like not forgiven you.
Correct.
Chess, that's a higher. That's a
Yeah.
higher.
Yeah,
No, but
exactly.
I do want to say, I do want to say this though. As a teacher, I spent a lot of time when I was younger trying to figure out what's the right way to teach. And I think the sad fact is that there's no one right way, that different students are different and they're going to respond to different things. So I do think, to be honest, this, and I don't want to say it's not purely like a Russian style, right? Like many people have this style, but the style of I'm going to be like very authoritative, verging on authoritarian, like in the classroom. I'm going to be harsh. I'm going to be unsparing in my criticism. I think there are students who are going to thrive in that kind of environment and be like, that was what I needed at that time. But there's other students who could be really good and really do something in mathematics who are going to be crushed by that environment and are going to walk out and never come back. So I don't know how to grapple with that, because you only can be the kind of person you are and you only can be the kind of teacher you can be. I guess I would just say that it's good that there's a lot of different kinds of teachers. It's good they're not all Russian. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. And I think I probably would have appreciated someone who also kind of talked to me and figured out what was my motivational issues and like kind of address them head on. But that's too much to ask. So you write about geometry and you connect it to surprising places. Because in this podcast we're interested in making the world better, one of the most obvious places to start is politics. And I was delighted and surprised to read about kind of Lincoln's love for geometry and his attempts to square the circle. Do you want to maybe start with that?
Yeah, and this was actually new to me too. I'll say one thing that happens is I always make a plan for what's going to be in the book. And then, of course, when you start to write, you start to research, and then you go in completely different places. And then, of course, I think like most people, it's much more interesting to write about what you just learned than what you already knew. So this was a good example of something I didn't know I was going to write about Lincoln. But then when I learned about his kind of Euclidophilia, I put it like right near the beginning of the book because I liked it so much. So Lincoln, there's a famous interview with him that asks like, where the interviewer asked him, like, how did you become such a compelling speaker, so persuasive, so able to bring people around to your way of thinking? And his answer is surely something that the interviewer did not expect. He says, like, I get it from Euclid. So Euclid is, if you guys don't know the name, like Euclid is the sort of resident of ancient North Africa, the mathematician in sort of Greek North Africa and Alexandria, who he creates the beginning of modern geometry as a kind of rigorous exercise that we now know it. Now, we don't really know very much about the historical person Euclid. We don't know how much of this he developed and how much he was like compiling and organizing like the sort of general knowledge that was known to mathematicians of his time. But in any event, his book, The Elements, became synonymous with geometry, and it was what people would read if they wanted to learn the subject. And so Lincoln, this is before he was president. He was going around being a country lawyer in Illinois, and he said, I was constantly being asked to prove stuff. I'd be in court and they'd be like, did you prove this? Or I'd be asking somebody else if they prove something. He'd be like, what does this word actually mean? And he said, nobody could tell me. Nobody could tell me. So I decided I was going to go home and read Euclid and find out what it means to prove something. So this is something that everybody said about him, not necessarily in connection with geometry, but the people who were around him said Euclid was not going to make a fake argument. Sorry, not Euclid. Lincoln. Lincoln was not going to make a fake argument. Lincoln was not going to say something he could not back up. For him, that was the same thing as like robbing money out of your pocket. Like he would not do it. And I think at least in his own mind, he associated that with the geometric habit of you don't say a thing until you've proved it, until you've step by step derived it from whatever basic axioms that you have. Now, of course, a great unknowable question is, did Lincoln learn this from Euclid and get geometrized? Or was Lincoln just like this and found in Euclid something that sort of resonated with what was already in his character? That, of course, we can't know, and it's probably partly both. Now, as for squaring the circle, this is a famous ancient problem of classical geometry, where the problem is, given a circle on a piece of paper, can you construct a square that is the same area as the circle? And when you say construct, you mean it in this kind of traditional Greek way of you only got your two tools you're allowed to use. You're allowed to use a compass and you're allowed to use a straight edge. And this problem was worked on for thousands of years. It almost became like a synonym for difficulty. Dante starts one of his verses with saying, like, trying to express somebody's frustration. He was like, oh, like somebody trying to square the circle. That's how I felt. I was like so completely at loose ends and at a loss. In fact, I'm told that even in today, in like modern Greek, if somebody's like asking you to do too much, or you're like, come on, you're asking me to square the circle here. This is like a sort of standard expression. Lincoln, like many other people, tried his hands at this. His law partner remembers finding him just in a state of complete frenzy at his desk with 20 sheets of paper all around him and like all these different like colored pencils, like frantically working on this problem. And he worked on it for like 2 whole days and like barely slept. And then gave up. And then his partner said, we could tell he was a little sore about it. We could tell. We never brought it up again because we could tell he was like pretty disappointed. But what I think is great about Lincoln, like where he really comes off well for this, is that I love that he was ambitious enough to try it, even though centuries and centuries of people had failed. But he had enough humility to understand that he too had failed, that he hadn't actually done it. And actually, not everybody has that. There's a famous story of John Hobbes, who's well known as like a political philosopher of some repute, but actually he spent a huge amount of his time insisting that he was able to square the circle and trisect the angle and solve all these other conundra of classical geometry. And he would constantly like pester like the best British mathematicians of his day, like publishing these pamphlets and writing them endless letters being like, yeah, I know you explained why my last sort of 6 proofs of this were wrong, but here's my new one, which is like definitely right. I challenge you, prove me wrong, like again and again. And if you're a mathematician, you actually get letters all the time from people who are quite confident that they have solved old, unsolved problems of mathematics or have done things which have been proved to be impossible. It's a pretty interesting window into the human psyche. And people are very attracted to the idea of doing impossible things. Squaring the circle, by the way, is impossible, but Lincoln didn't know. It was widely thought to be impossible by Lincoln's time, but it wasn't proved until the 1880s. Now we know. Now if somebody tells you they squared the circle, you absolutely know they didn't do it. It's not just a reasonable guess, it's certainty.
Interesting. So I would love to talk a little bit about the more practical aspects of politics. And one of the topics that you touch on is gerrymandering, which I think is, our American listeners would definitely be aware of this, but maybe give it a little bit of an intro to gerrymandering and then how geometry help us maybe deal with that.
Yeah, and for the American listeners, if you don't know about it yet, you're going to know about it soon because it's going to be a very hot live political issue over the course of calendar year 2021 as we grapple with the new census data. Because what happens is every time a new census comes in and we have official population data for all the states, we have to redraw the districts that states are broken into. In the U.S., we break states into districts for election to the House of Representatives, and we break them into even smaller districts for the, in some ways, more important state legislatures. And what we have come to know, especially over the last few decades, is that whoever has the power to draw those maps, to choose how the state is divided into pieces, actually has an immense amount of power over who gets elected to the legislature and who gets elected to Congress. You might think it wouldn't matter that much if a state has this percentage of Democrats and this percentage of Republicans. You might think, however you cut it, it's gonna amount to the same. It doesn't matter whether the line is like a little bit this way or a little bit that way. And that would be a perfectly reasonable guess, and it's empirically wrong. It turns out that by choosing where those lines are, you can actually make a huge difference. What it also turns out is that's a very geometric question, but not in the way you might think. Historically, to the extent that people thought about gerrymandering, they were like, oh, what happens is people draw these really weird shaped districts in order to capture exactly some set of voters that they want. And it has like a million like tentacles and protrusions, and it like looks very funny. And historically, that kind of thing was done. But now, because you can riffle through so many different options with high-speed computing, you can make very gerrymandered district maps. And I happen to live in one here in the state of Wisconsin, which look fine. The districts look fine. They're like nice, neat, vaguely rectangular things. You can do gerrymandering that's undetectable to the naked eye.
Interesting. I think it's important to give a little bit of a background. So the terms that I've heard is cracking and packing when it comes to gerrymandering. So maybe if you can explain what they actually do to essentially manipulate the election results based on these divisions into counties. I think that's...
Oh, sure. And I actually don't use the words cracking and packing in the book, although they're good words, just because I don't think it's the exact mechanism is not so important, but the underlying principle is always that the map is in your favor when there are a few districts that you lose by a lot and a lot of districts where you win by a little. So if you imagine a state where the two major parties have about 50% of the voters each, and I happen, as I said, to live in such a state, so I have a lot of experience with this, the way you would want your party to win lots of seats is if there was like a few seats that had 100% Democrats and used up all the Democrats in the state, or maybe almost all the Democrats in the state. And then you had a lot of seats that were, let's say, 55% Republican and 45% Democrats. So states that under any normal political conditions, Republicans would win those seats. And if you could arrange for that to happen, you could very easily create a situation where there was a few seats Democrats absolutely dominatingly won, and many seats where Republicans won by modest margins, but margins big enough that they were not likely to be overtaken by political events. And if you can draw the districts that way, it's a little bit of a cartoon, but it's not so different from what we actually have. You can create a situation where even though the state as a whole is rather swingy, like sometimes Republicans win the presidency here, sometimes Democrats win, sometimes Republicans win the governorship, sometimes Democrats win at the statewide level, there's all kinds of swings. Nonetheless, under the current map, the state legislature is essentially irrevocably in Republican hands. I would take a sort of complete political earthquake for Democrats to be competitive to get a majority in the state legislature. And that's a result of the way that the maps are drawn.
Interesting. And so how can geometry help us counter that?
So yeah, if it's not the geometry of the district itself, if it's not the shape of the district, what is it? What you have to do is, and this is a move that is made again and again in the book, and it's so characteristic of modern math, it's you pass from the sort of more simple geometry to a higher and more abstract geometry. And in this case, it's the geometry of the space of all possible ways to break the state up into districts. That is a huge space. There are a lot of ways you could break Wisconsin up into 99 pieces, which is how many assembly districts we have. And in some sense, in essence, the geometry of how mathematicians now study this problem is a question of how do we efficiently explore this gigantic high-dimensional space, which is fundamentally a geometric question. And the reason we want to do this is because you want to be able to make the case that the maps we have are outliers. That to prove that if you were to, let's say, produce thousands and thousands of randomly drawn maps that were made by a computer who did not care whether Democrats or Republicans win, right? So they're a priori unbiased because we didn't program the computer to be biased, that the map we have is drastically more advantageous to the party that drew the map than any of these randomly chosen ones. You know, I mean, a lot of times I'll say this. I think you go into this thinking, oh, maybe you can find some mathematical or geometrical algorithm for producing the best map, the perfect map, the map that's absolutely fair. And that turns out to be a fool's errand. That's a squaring the circle of gerrymandering. There's no such thing as zero unfairness in this world. So then you say, what is it? What's the goal then? The goal is that even if you can't say what's exactly fair, or even if there's no standard for exact fairness that everyone would agree on, you can still agree on what's radically unfair. That's a much easier question. So I think the approach nowadays is to say, let's find ways to reliably identify the absolute worst offenders and find some way to rule those out legally. Because the system we have, I said, the people who draw those lines have a huge power over who gets seated in the state legislature. In a lot of places, who draws them? The existing state legislators. That's who does it. That is you want to talk about design, right? That is a failure of design.
It's a design flaw, yeah.
And I think in some sense, like, there are states where it's designed better, where there's like less of a feedback loop and the sort of people making those decisions are not the people in a position to directly benefit from it. Maybe you have a panel of retired judges. Okay, they may have their partisan sympathies. They may not be completely fair, but at least they're not like literally the people whose livelihood and political career depends on those decisions they make and that they're in a position to influence. So one thing that makes me optimistic about this is that I feel like we almost have the worst possible system. So honestly, almost any way we disrupt it is probably going to make it better. Like it's like kicking the TV, like maybe it'll start working again. So yeah, but the system we have now, the incentives for legislators to absolutely gerrymander the hell out of the map as badly as they possibly can is so great that they feel like they almost can't not do it. And the people who actually do the work are political operatives, people who work for a political party. And they're like, what I am paid for when I wake up every morning is to make life, if you're in this political party, as good as possible, and to make life, if you're in the other political party, as bad as possible. That is what they see their job as being. But I think in general, people don't like gerrymandering, right? People when they know about it, they recognize that it's dirty. And so I think if we can reduce the incentives, if we can say, okay, you can still gerrymander, but not so much, I think that opens up political space for people to compromise and maybe move to a better design. And I think that if we could legally constrain the very worst offenses and make the incentives for doing it not so great. What I say in the book is, if you don't want people to shoplift, maybe don't leave the open jar of candy like right next to the door of the store. Like, just put it somewhere else so it's not so easy.
Yeah.
I don't know. One thing we argue about in America a lot is this issue of, and this came up in the Supreme Court case about this, is this question of proportional representation. So I'm curious what you think as an Israeli, which has a completely different system from ours, where there are no geographic districts and parties are represented in Knesset in proportion to their proportion to the vote past the threshold. I always say to Americans who are like, why don't we just have proportional representation? Wouldn't everything like work and be fair? I say, like, how much do you know about Israeli politics?
Exactly.
But I'm curious to know, as someone with experience in both systems, do you feel like one system is clearly superior to the other, or do you feel like they both have super big design flaws and structural problems?
Yeah.
Which is how I've come to feel.
It's interesting. There's definitely some benefits to a more representative parliamentary democracy. One is things change very rapidly. So if there's a new priority or people are beginning to come to a new way of thinking about something, the next elections, there'll be a party that's the core message and you can vote for it. And we've had like parties form and get tremendous amount of power in a matter of months. So because it's a charismatic person who got some really high quality people that everybody trusts, and they have this new brand, this new message. And this is like last elections, it was like blue and white, Kahol Lavan. They almost beat out Netanyahu, and they were a brand new party. They were created right before the election, and with a new like statement of principle. You can download the document of their policy statements, and so it's really refreshing and it's really dynamic, and you are much more likely to find people that you support or parties that you support because there's so many. And it also benefits intelligence in the leaders, not necessarily good morals, but because you have to form these sophisticated coalitions with many different parties, the people who end up at the top are people who are good at bringing people together and finding compromises and getting things to work. So from that perspective, it's very good. From another perspective, the one thing that I envy about American politics is there's this very strong pull to the center, because there's only two parties, and each of them has to find appeal to a very broad, large swath of the population. And there are much fewer extremist voices. Now it's different and weird in the sense that like some very extremist voices seem to have taken over a party, but there's still, so that's the risk of it. But in Israel, yes, there are extremist voices and they get just a few votes and just a few seats. And then there's more moderate voices and get a few more seats. And in any case, the person at the top will have to form this coalition, which is challenging and interesting. But Israel, I think the main issue with Israel is it doesn't have a constitution. If it had a constitution that formally created things, it wouldn't be in such chaos, I think.
But this actually brings us to a really interesting point that ties together some of the stuff we've talked about, because the United States, of course, does have a constitution.
Yep.
And so you might think, oh, great, so the ground rules are set. No, they're completely not. And I think we live in a world where there's a kind of fiction that the Constitution is like the axioms of Euclid. Like, it tells you the rules, and then you can derive everything from that. And if you're a mathematician and you say, I'm just going to look at the Constitution or a state constitution and figure out what's allowed and what's not, guess what? It's not like Euclid. It is not, in fact, like a set of axioms from which you can rigorously derive what the answers are to all questions.
Right.
That's why we have judges, and Israel has a Supreme Court too. But in some sense, I think our courts are more like the Israel Supreme Court than they want to admit that they are, right? Sort of, we have a written constitution, and so the judges have to claim that they're deriving everything from the principles enshrined in the Constitution. But one thing I learned from the great legal scholar Richard Posner is that the cases where you can figure out what the answer is from the Constitution, they don't get to the Supreme Courts, because those are like pretty easy. They're like settled by a unanimous decision lower down. If a case comes to a high court, a state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's the subject of great division, it's because the Constitution actually doesn't have the answer to that question. It reminds me a little bit, if we're just going to like go totally Jewish on this podcast, how people see the Torah, right? If you like read the Talmudic scholars, they are constrained to say the answer has to be somewhere in the Torah.
Correct. Yeah.
Because that's the rule, right? So whatever conclusion we come to, we can't just say we decided what was best. We have to find textual support. And not to get controversial, but like that's like a little bit of a fiction, right? It's not, you can't deductively derive everything from either the US Constitution or the Torah, full of wisdom as both of those documents are. Like if it's true that all answers can be found there, they're found there by some process that's more loose than
creative,
pure deduction. And in fact, I end the book, I said I ended the book on Rita Dove's poem about geometry, but I really ended by combining that poem with this Talmudic story of the oven of Achnai. I don't know if you know this story or not, but it's this famous story where a bunch of rabbis are arguing about some incredibly fine point of kashrut, as rabbis do. The laws of dietary purity. One rabbi is arguing alone. All the other rabbis agree except one. One rabbi is alone. And he's saying, look, if I'm right and you're wrong, let the trees show it. And like the trees like jump out of their roots. Like they just jump right out of the ground. And like all the rabbis are like, okay, so who cares what the tree says? Like we stand by our position. Okay, if I'm right and you're wrong, let the river show it. And the river sort of changes its direction right when he's standing there. And the other rabbis are like, who cares? Like we already discussed this. We came to a vote and like you lost. So finally, he's really mad. He says, okay, if I'm right and you're wrong, let God show it. And God comes down from heaven and says, okay, look, like, he's right and you all are wrong about this. And the other rabbis are like, okay, like, who cares? Like the Torah is not in heaven. Like the Torah is down here. We have a system, and the system is we have a vote, and we read the text and figure out who wins. So they ignore God literally coming down and saying like this one lone rabbi is. And the end of this story, this very famous Talmudic moment, is that then what happens? Then God laughs. God is like absolutely delighted by this development, and he says, "My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me," and he disappears. What an incredible moment! And I think this Talmudic story speaks to the same thing that Rita Dove is speaking to, that when we sort of reason, and especially for a lot of people, geometry is where we learn to do this, we are learning to take the authority for ourselves. And even if God comes down from heaven and tells you you're wrong, you're like, too bad, I proved it. I used the system of reason and that's, I will say this is an incredibly controversial Talmudic story, by the way. I have my read on it. There are other Talmudic people who read it a different way.
I love that. I love that story, and I did not know it. I think it reminds me of kind of Zen koan. If you see the Buddha meditating down the road, kill him, because it's not about the Buddha. It's about your own enlightenment, your own connection.
Oh, that's good. Had I thought of it, I might have referenced that there too, because you're right. It's like it's very appropriate.
It's really interesting. So let's talk about, I'm very involved and interested in deep learning and the future of AI and neural networks. Partly, I wrote my thesis on this. I'd love to hear how can geometry help us understand what's going on in the world today with deep learning and AI?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to do in the book is just to expose some of the basic geometric principles that underlie what's actually going on under the hood of deep learning, because I think it is pretty amazing what people are able to do. But at the same time, I think people see it as like a form of magic, which I think is intellectually unhealthy for people to see anything as magic, any piece of tech, because there is no magic. And in fact, although the details of implementation are incredibly complicated, the basic idea of deep learning is incredibly simple. And I'll tell you what it is right now. I say it in the book. It's a method called gradient descent. That's a sort of fancy mathematical term. But what's going on is essentially this. You're trying to devise a strategy for doing something. Maybe it's predicting the next word you're going to type in your email, or maybe it's distinguishing an image of a cat from an image of a dog, like any of these kind of typical like AI applications. And you have the strategy you have, and you have some what's called training set of data that you've already seen. Like maybe think about how a baby learns what's a cat and what's a dog. There's a person there who's like pointing at things and going, if it's a cat, if they're and pointing at dogs and saying dog, right? So you have some set of data you start with. You can't figure out from first principles what a cat is. Okay, so the machine needs that too. So you give it some list of images that are labeled. These 1,000 images are cats. These 1,000 images are dogs. Okay, you have some strategy, some algorithm for figuring out what's a cat or what's a dog. Maybe you choose it completely at random, which seems like a crazy thing to do, but do that and test it on the cats and dogs that you've been given. Probably doesn't work too well. Okay, so now You simply do this. You say, what are all the little ways that I could modify my strategy? Try them all and see which one improves its performance most on the cats and dogs I've already been given. Okay, now I have a new strategy that's like a little bit better. Okay, now see what are the tiny ways I could modify it, see which one improves my performance the most, do it again, and just keep doing that until it works well. That, like, literally, that's all it is. And what I compare it to, the metaphor I use in the book, is that it's if you were trying to climb a mountain, but the landscape you were in was like very dense in vegetation, and there was like lots of tall trees, and you couldn't see which way the peak was. The simplest thing you could do would just be to like, look, let me look right around my feet and see which direction is up and walk that way.
Yeah.
And then having taken a couple steps, reassess, see which direction is up from where I am now and walk that way. That's very simple-minded, but it actually works pretty well. And literally every single ultra hardcore AI system on the planet is basically running that process. That is what it is doing. Except that, of course, instead of walking around a landscape, a sort of a three-dimensional landscape, it's exploring some ultra high dimensional landscape of possible strategies. This is, again, when I said that this happens in the book a lot. We study these higher geometries. But GPT-3, this like very cool device that produces artificial English text, which I love playing with it. I don't know if you've played with this one.
Yeah, it seems crazy powerful. I haven't played with it directly, but I played with some implementations of it. It seems crazy powerful in some ways.
Me too, just the implementations, yeah. It is searching 175 billion dimensional landscape of possible text-producing strategies, constantly improving itself and seeing what's works best. But the way it searches is in this very simple-minded way of saying which of the many small tweaks I could make, which one improves my performance on the data I've already seen, and just do that and do it again and again. It really is almost as simple as that. And what's amazing, so Jeffrey Hinton, who's like one of the sort of pioneers of neural nets, somebody once asked him, like, how do you think about these like high dimensional spaces? And by the way, they were in this particular context, they weren't talking about 175 billion, they were talking about 14. He was talking about some 14-dimensional space. How do you visualize a 14-dimensional space? How do you even think about that? He said, you visualize a 3-dimensional space, and then you very loudly say 14. And that seems ridiculous, but it's actually true. And one of the great mysteries, but also one of the great pieces of good luck, is that this intuition that we form, geometry comes from our bodies, right? We form our intuitions about it from our 2-dimensional field of vision and from our 3-dimensional space that our bodies move around in. And the intuitions that we form there, good news for us, they work pretty well in 14-dimensional space or 175 billion dimensional space. And we talked at the beginning about this tension between understanding things and doing things very formally and rigidly. The advantage of the formal stuff is that it allows you to make sure you know what you mean when you're talking about 175 billion dimensional space. The formal tools of geometry allow you to prove theorems about that, but it's your basic bodily geometry that allows you to think about that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, and that makes total sense. So one thing that I'm super interested in is the network model of reality itself. Not just so in some ways, in some traditions, like our brain is a massive network. People are beginning to see reality as a massive network. It's a great story metaphor in Buddhism of Indra's net, where I don't know if you know this, but it's essentially...
No, please tell me.
So the gods have hung up this glorious net, and it covers all of the universe. And it's this network reaching into infinity. And at every junction, at every node of the net, they put a very precious jewel. And each jewel is reflecting all the other jewels across the entire universe, the entire network. And it's this model of the world as this infinite network that is infinitely self-referential. And it's enough to look at one jewel and you can start and you see the reflection of the whole net. And in a way, you wrote a little bit about dynamical systems and nonlinearity. And it feels like there's a geometry to the underlying fabric of reality that is interesting in itself. So any thoughts on that?
I wonder if Indra knew about eigenvalues. That's what it sounds like was the idea that they were trying to express. In some sense, so there's a ton of networks in the book, and I write about that especially in the context of, I wrote a lot about the spread of pandemics and the geometry of epidemic spread. Not a topic, again, a topic I did not know I was going to write about when I started writing this book in 2019. And for some reason, I suddenly got very interested in this subject like about a year ago and wrote a lot about it because, of course, studying how an epidemic spreads has everything to do with networks, and particularly the network of human beings and their interaction, right? Like each one of us is like a little jewel, just like in Indra's net. And what you find when you study this is that on the one hand, you might say, this question is purely what you might say in math, local. Like it just has to do with like you and the people directly around you, because that's who you're going to interact with. But in fact, the long-term and large-scale behavior of spread through a network somehow in a deep way has to do with the entire network globally at once. It's not really a purely local phenomenon, or rather it's global and local both. You can't really untangle them from each other. So I think this metaphor you said of the net, which is one was unfamiliar to me, it feels like that same kind of thing we think about when we study spread through a network, which is something that's like highly relevant to pandemics. And then this notion of eigenvalues and eigenvectors, which I talk about a little bit in the book, that somehow are these like features that can't be seen from any individual piece of the network. They're really properties of the whole network at once that somehow involve all of the nodes. That has that same kind of feeling. Now, as to what reality actually is, maybe like a little bit above my pay grade, but it reminds me a bit of this whole story with the development of relativity and the crisis of physics, which I write about early in the book, where, mathematicians had understood that in principle, there were geometries other than the one that Euclid had studied, these non-Euclidean geometries. And Henri Poincaré, the great French geometer who's like a major figure in the book in various ways, he was one of the people who understood a lot of these different geometries, and even understood that somehow the symmetries in these geometries somehow had something to do with these kind of strange anomalies that people were discovering in physics, especially as you approach the speed of light. But it was really Einstein who took the last step and said, maybe this is like not a metaphor. Maybe this is actually the way space is. Maybe the kind of geometry we thought we lived in is not the geometry we really live in. So maybe this question of the role of pure mathematicians is very important, because our work is not really about what is, it's about what could be. But often you have to know, when you're deciding what you think is, it's very good to have had people do the groundwork of understanding all the things that could be, so you can choose like among them which one most resembles what actually is. So I think for your question, I don't know what reality is. That's a hard question. Yeah. But I do know a lot about network theory. Yeah. And I do know that pure mathematicians like James Sylvester, who's a figure in the book, like Paul Erdős, who's a figure in the book, like Steve Strogatz, who's a figure in the book, and would be a great guy to have on your cast, by the way, because he's alive, unlike many of the other older figures in the book. We have done the work of understanding a lot about different kinds of networks and what they're like. And I think that's necessary groundwork for people who want to understand what things actually are in the world.
I think, so I'll just comment on this idea of networks. For me, it feels like some aspects of reality that we know are there, like dynamical systems and like the unpredictability of systems as you put elements together and kind of behave in unexpected ways. And the aspects of nonlinearity, a lot of them might be pointing us to a direction of a more interdependent, networked model for things. Like, and one of the interesting things in complex systems is arbitrarily draw the border around them, but they're actually always part of a bigger system, right? Or they're
you're gerrymandering reality, man.
Exactly. And I find that fascinating. One topic.
The thing is, though, that I think chaotic dynamics and nonlinearity, those are also properties of very simple systems. That's the thing. I wouldn't say that the fact that things are like frequently chaotic, and Poincaré sort of discovers chaotic dynamics just by thinking about like a universe where there's literally only 3 things in it.
Yeah.
So complex behavior, but I wouldn't say it's nothing like some incredibly complicated infinite network. That's not Indra's net. That's like a world with only 3 planets in it. And already there you see the chaos. So I think the presence of interesting dynamics and nonlinearities and like all this kind of stuff, I don't think that tells you at all what the underlying nature of reality is, because basically whatever it is, you're going to have interesting dynamics.
That's interesting.
You also, by the way, I'll say you mentioned PageRank as a model, and I'll say that PageRank is our paradigmatic modern example of how you use these ideas of eigenvalues and eigenvectors. I write about that in the book, the sort of development of PageRank, where how important Google thinks a web page is not a property just of that page. It's a property of how that page is situated in the entire network in a sort of deep global way. And them understanding that, which in some sense was like sophomore year of college level math, but nobody else was doing it.
Yeah.
And it completely changed everything almost overnight in the 90s. I'm old enough to remember the incredible difference that it made when that came out.
I do remember that. And it is a geometrical insight that kind of steps out of the world of content into looking into, content, it lives in context. And
yes.
we can conjecture about the importance of something based on where it's embedded. It's super, super interesting. I want to be mindful of your time. So I could go to my last question, or I can open one last can of worms. So you tell me.
Open it. The worm. I can hear them squirming inside the can. I know they want to get out.
Nice. So one aspect, and this is, I actually don't know whether it falls under geometry or mathematics in general, but one thing that I'm super, super interested in is this question of entropy and negative entropy, and how our world seems to be pretty good at creating new complex systems over time. And so, I wonder if you dove into that and your thoughts about how mathematics can inform that conversation. Because I think a lot of people, like the person who wrote Big History, a lot of people at Yuval Noah Harari are seeing this, creative aspect of existence as something very meaningful and that kind of forms our whole history.
Yeah, so this is very hard, right? And I am not a physicist, and yet you can't write about this stuff without getting into physics. So I wrote a little bit about entropy in the book, and I hope people will feel like the true physicists will feel like I did an okay job. But part of the crisis of physics that happens in the beginning of the 20th century, and Poincaré writes about this quite movingly, is like people were really trying to grapple with, are the laws or are they statistical laws? Are they tendencies? And I think Poincaré was always like rather undecided about this. He was very suspicious of like probabilistic thinking, but at the same time, he was very open-minded and learned a lot about it. And so entropy is one of these things that's exactly like this. You call it like a law of thermodynamics, but is it a law or is it only a statistical tendency? If you have the soup, you say the law is it's not going to suddenly divide into hot. The lukewarm soup is not going to suddenly divide into hot on one side of the bowl and cold on the other. But is that a law in the same way that Newton's laws are laws? Is it the same way that the speed of light being a maximum is a law? Or is it a statistical law where what we're really saying is it's very unlikely that the soup would separate itself in this way? It's just something that it's so unlikely that we shouldn't be surprised that no human has ever seen it happen. So I think that in very loosely speaking, and I say it somewhat more carefully, but honestly not very precisely in the book either, one way of thinking about entropy is just to say that there's more states that we tend to see as disordered than ordered. And so if states are in a random state, we're more likely to see a disordered one. This sort of phenomenon that if you have a headphone cord in your pocket, it's going to tangle up. But that's not because there's some law that tangledness must increase. It's because the forces that it undergoes in your pocket are essentially random, and it moves into a random configuration, and all the possible configurations the cord can be in. There's way more tangled ones than there are untangled ones. And so tangled is more likely. I think so I think that when mathematicians think about entropy, okay, I took you to be meaning entropy in the sort of sense of structuredness or orderedness of like physical objects, as opposed to, in math, we like to overload our words. So entropy applied to a random variable in the sense of information theory is like a related but not exactly the same thing, which has a more precise mathematical definition. But yeah, so let me put it this way. I don't think mathematicians are struck dumb with surprise by the fact that stuff exists, that there's interesting stuff in the world that we encounter. I don't think we tend to see that as like a problem that's a threat to our theories and that has to be explain. But obviously, I'm not a philosopher, right? And so why is there something rather than nothing is certainly like a chestnut philosophical problem.
Yeah. Interesting. So I have this kind of closing question that I like to ask these days. And so in his TED Talk, Alain de Botton, who's a philosopher,
and bon vivant.
Yeah, exactly. Writes about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And he says a lecture is trying to give you a little bit of information, and a sermon is urgently trying to change your life. And so my question to you is, if I gave you like a stage for a short sermon, something that you think has the potential to change people's lives, what would it be?
God, is it optional? Sermonizing is so not my thing. I feel like as a teacher, lecturing is not so much my thing. What my feeling is that as somebody who's spent his life in mathematics, like I'm so excited about it. I'm excited every time I think about it. I'm excited when I learn about it. I feel like my role as a teacher is just to be excited in public. But the idea of a sermon, the idea of I'm here to change your life, I think people get to decide what their own life is. They shouldn't have to listen to me as to how their life should be. But what I do think is that all of us have stuff that just like lights up our minds. And I think for most people, it's enjoyable to be in the presence of people who are talking about the things that they're most lit up about. But what people choose to take from that, I want to let them choose, which I think is the opposite of sermonizing.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
That's okay. That's a type of sermon. That's you just sermonized and not sermonizing.
Oh crap! You tricked me into sermonizing.
No, I think that's really interesting and probably fair thing to say, that you're not out there saying everybody should be a mathematician or everybody should process the world this way. You're just trying to get them excited.
Yeah, and maybe to some extent, I'm trying to say, here's the incredible reach of this subject as I see it. So maybe ask yourself whether some of this resonates with stuff that you are already thinking about, stuff that you maybe didn't call mathematics or didn't call geometry. But hey, if this resonates you, maybe you are doing more math than you think. In the same way that Abraham Lincoln saw Euclid and was like, wow, I'm more interested in this than I knew I was. This resonates with something that's already in me. I hope that is true for a lot of people. And just from what people have told me about reading my books, I think that is true for a lot of people.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jordan. This was an enlightening, interesting, fun conversation.
Yeah, we went to a lot of places.
Yep, we did. So have a great rest of the day, and thank you so much.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.